Hey class, Mr. Stewart here, and this is going to be the integrity video for, let's see, for the summer term. It'll be week 9 in regard to Chapter 15, the juvenile justice system. So I'm going to take just a few minutes here and kind of hit some of the high spots here in regard to the juvenile justice system. Everything that you've talked about, or that you've read and we've talked about thus far in the course, has really had to do with the adult system. And one of the things that you should have kind of gained from looking at the adult criminal justice system is that the focus is on punishment. It's all about finding someone guilty, proving that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and punishing them according to the crime. Well, the juvenile justice system is not set up the same way. Although it has a lot of parallels to the adult system, the juvenile system is really set up to be focused on rehabilitation. And getting to the root cause of whatever the juvenile offender's behavior is, and getting them the help necessary to correct that behavior so that we don't further injure that juvenile through exposure within the system, nor do we create an adult offender. You know, the minute they turn 18, we don't want to have to be dealing with them in adult court. So in a perfect world, that's the way the juvenile justice system is supposed to work, is that it's more focused on rehabilitation and treatment than it is punishment. Unfortunately, we don't see that it always works out that way, but that's what the focus is supposed to be. Give you a little bit of history in regard to the juvenile justice system. Is that back in the 1800s there was this movement called the child savers movement, or the child saving movement. And to give you a little more, even more background on why we even needed such a thing, is that, you know, understand we had an industrial revolution in the United States. And what happened during the Industrial Revolution is people were moving out of the rural areas, the pastoral areas, if you will, where they grew what they needed or they bartered for what they needed, and they were moving into the cities to work in factories and industries where now you could go to the store or to the market and you could buy what you needed. So it wasn't a lot of as much barter, and definitely wasn't any growing of whatever. So what that ended up doing was, hey, if mom and dad and their 2 kids moved from the country into town, mom and dad were working in industry in order to pay the high-priced rent, in order to buy food, etc., etc. So what you end up having was parents who were absent from the home for long periods of time each day. You know, there was no such thing as an 8-hour work day at that point, or even a 40-hour work week. A lot of times it was, you know, 12, 14, 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And so what that ended up doing was leaving children up to kind of their own devices. And you and I both know that the idle hands do the devil's work, if you will. So what happened was a lot of these kids who are now left alone and somewhat to raise themselves for the greatest majority of each and every day began to kind of get up to no good. They formed youth gangs. They ended up engaging in thievery, in assaults. You know, you name it, they were doing it. You know, in the early to mid 1800s. So you had a group of concerned, wealthy, civic-minded citizens who really began to be concerned with the welfare of these disadvantaged children. Now, there's some speculation as to whether they were really that concerned with helping the kids, or whether they just wanted to protect their own stuff from all of these kids. So, and there's evidence to support either school of thought there. So just understand that for whatever reason they formed the child-saving movement, it was doing something where prior to that nothing was being done. So the child-saving movement actually argued that the state had a responsibility to take control of children who exhibit criminal tendencies or have been neglected by their parents. And this is what we call, if you go back to this previous slide, the doctrine of parens patriae. And that simply means that, hey, if the parents aren't doing their job, or the kids are up to no good, the state can actually come in legally and take custody. And it might be a physical custody, or it might simply be a legal custody, or it could be both, of those children in order to try to curb their behavior and get them on the right track. So what began to happen was in 1825 we saw something called houses of refuge open in some of the major cities here in the United States. In the beginning, they were actually decent places. It was actually homes that agreed to take a few disadvantaged kids in that weren't being fed or looked after properly, and teach them some discipline, teach them some rules of the house, and make sure their needs were looked after. But just like anything else, they underestimated the problem. And it wasn't too long before these houses of refuge became more like little prisons, and the conditions weren't very good, and the children were used almost like in slave labor to a certain degree. So by 1899, the city of Chicago, Illinois had had enough, and they established the very first juvenile court system. And it was based on this idea that it should be different than adult court, because we're really trying to look after the safety and welfare of these children. And what we've done up to that point had not worked, which was these houses of refuge. So some of the major differences between the early juvenile court and adult court was that there was no jury. They also used different terminology. For example, if in adult court we arrest someone and we try them. In juvenile court we take custody of them and we go through a dispositional hearing, if you will, or an adjudicatory hearing. So the terminology is a little more warm and fuzzy with the juvenile court, and I'm not going to get into that terminology. Your book does a really good job of explaining that and the differences in the terminology. There's also no adversarial relationship, and if you think about the adult system, it's the state versus the defendant. With juvenile court, it's not really about the state versus a juvenile or the city versus a juvenile. It's about, let's identify what the problems with this kid are and give them the treatment and rehabilitation necessary so that we don't really have to deal with them as adult offenders. So there was no adversarial relationship, and because there's no adversarial relationship, then of course there's no jury. Typically you just have a judge that decides the facts of the case. And look at this timeline here. The first juvenile court ever was established in 1899, and 46 years later every single state had one. So a little bit less than a year per state, basically, for every state. Well, yeah, I mean, because by that time we had 48 states. We didn't have Alaska and Hawaii by 1945 yet. I think it was 1959 and maybe 1961 or something that Alaska and Hawaii became states, but they were territories. But so we had 48 states at that point, and within 46 years, you had basically 48 states adopt a juvenile court. So let's talk about a couple of the single most important Supreme Court cases with respect to juvenile justice. The N. Ray Galt case held that juveniles are entitled to many of the same due process rights granted to adult offenders. Prior to this case, juveniles were not given the same rights or many of the same rights as adult offenders. And somebody said, well, it's probably necessary that we do, because we need to try to treat juveniles at least as good as we treat adults, if not better. So, make sure you read about that case in the text. It does a good job of explaining it as well. What are some of the risk factors for juvenile offending? Well, of course, the age. Typically, the older the juvenile is, the more serious offenses that they become engaged in. Whether or not they are addicted to or they're abusing some sort of drug or alcohol, that makes the juvenile justice system a little different than the adult system. Whether or not the child has been abused or neglected, whether or not they are in a gang or not, or whether they have used guns or weapons. So all of these things are really risk factors that if you see a juvenile who is exhibiting one or more of these risk factors, then very likely they're probably going to be engaged in some sort of offending. Okay. Indicate some reasons why youth join gangs. you know, you have to understand the whole gang mindset. Gang mindset in that gangs want as many people as possible to be part of their gang so that they can have as many worker bees as possible. And it is it's a mind game from the gang itself to get people to join, because they will create the illusion of family. And many of these juveniles do not have good family lives, and so the gang says, hey, you know, you want something to eat, we'll always feed you. You want somebody to snuggle up with, we can provide that too. You want somebody that'll love you and care for you, we got your back. And in many cases, these juveniles just don't get that at home, so they are attracted into the gang because of the fact that they're going to be protected, they're going to have some of their needs met, or at least some of their perceived needs. But it's also a status symbol. It gives them some excitement to be part of it. Many of them look at it like, hey, this is the new mafia, if you will. It's cool to be in the gang, or if I am in the gang, then I'm the big man on the totem pole instead of the little peon down at the bottom that has to do what everybody else says. Now you do what I say. But there's also some people join gangs out of fear, and it could be that if they know gang membership is almost the same as being in a rival gang in some locations. So they join the gang so that they are protected. And they can lessen their own fear, and sometimes the gang almost forces people to join. They basically threaten them enough, or threaten their family enough that they say, look, okay, yes, I'll join because I'm scared what might happen if I don't. So these are all some of the reasons why kids join gangs. How do police officers deal with juvenile offenders? This table gives you a pretty good idea of kind of the timeline as to how the juvenile justice system works, but understand that it still has a lot to do with discretion, in that police officers will, they have this discretionary authority that they can put a kid in juvenile court or not. They can take custody of them or have mom and dad come get them. They can write them a ticket and send them on their way in many cases. So what are some of the factors that change that or cause that discretion to be used or not used? And the fact is, how serious the offense is. Has the police officer dealt with this kid in the past? Is there some sort of past criminal history or past history with the department? What's the attitude of the offender? How amenable are they to being contacted by the police? If they're MFing you here and there and everywhere, then the police are likely to take custody of you then if you're saying yes sir and no sir and anything you say sir. So just understand that. But also look at the role of the parents. Are the parents in the picture somewhere? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing and the kid just made a mistake? Or are the parents not in the picture? Or are the parents doing bad stuff too? That may make a difference in how the police officer handles that particular juvenile. As well as the setting of the offense, where the offense occurs, may affect the use of discretion. Now, it should not affect discretion as to what the race and the gender of the offender are, but unfortunately we still see some discrimination. It is much lessened than what it was in the past, but we still see it happen from time to time. And there's some people that's going to let one particular race go while at the same time they never let somebody of another particular race go. So some of these cases they use a lot of discretion, some they don't, and unfortunately it sometimes does depend upon the race and the gender of the offender. Historically, what you've seen is that girls were able to get away with a whole lot more than guys were, than boys were. We're seeing that change in recent years, but we're still seeing some discrimination in regard to race and ethnicity, which is unfortunate, but we still see it. It does still affect some enforcement of the law, whether it's a juvenile or an adult. So that is still out there, but again, it's much decreased than it has been in the past. Your book does a pretty good job of describing the four primary stages of the juvenile court process, and so you just need to make sure you read through that. know the difference between an adjudicatory hearing and a disposition hearing. It is a bifurcated, which means two separate processes, so it's a bifurcated process, which means you're going to have an adjudication hearing, which that's where we determine if you're guilty or not guilty of the offense. And then you have a detention hearing, which determines whether or not you should be institutionalized, put away in a juvenile detention facility because you were found guilty of the offense. You were found to be delinquent. So this is a separate hearing. And we do this in many cases for the adults as well, especially if it's a major or complex case where there's a life imprisonment issue or a death penalty case. It's a bifurcated process as well. So it's two separate hearings in many cases. So just understand that's one of the parallels with the juvenile system versus the adult system. In many cases, we will institutionalize serious juvenile offenders. We'll put them in like a residential type treatment program. Sometimes probably the most common punishment that we give juveniles is simply probation. We're going to say, hey, look, you got some rules that you got to live by, and if you don't live by these rules, then we're going to bring you back in and punish you more severely. The next step up from that would be non-secure confinement, which would be like a halfway house, or we put you in foster care or something. You're being confined, or it may even be just some sort of non-prison type facility, a juvenile home, or like in Huntsville, I think they call it the D home, something like that. That's kind of the next step up from probation. The next step up from non-secure confinement is going to be secure confinement. That's when we actually put you in what I would like to call a juvenile prison. It is secure just like an adult prison is, but it doesn't have adults. It just has kids. These are pretty horrible places, honestly. The conditions are just almost very similar to that of adult facilities. The inmates there, juveniles, are treated almost like adult prisoners, that type of thing. So you've really got to foul up or engage in a very serious offense to be put in secure confinement for the most part. We're trying here in recent years not to institutionalize, because we know that can actually be more harmful to the juvenile than some of the other lesser punishments or sanctions are. And then, of course, if you do get institutionalized, at some point you're going to be released. Or at some point before you come off probation or after you come out of non-secure confinement, you're probably going to be released. And prior to that release, we're going to put you in an aftercare program. Aftercare is most closely consistent with parole in the adult system, which means if we let you out of confinement, we don't just throw you back out to the world for the most part. We put you in a program where at least we keep up with you and we give you some more services and some treatment and rehabilitation while you're outside the walls of the confinement center, the detention center, if you will. So aftercare is very important, because that's what allows that juvenile to reintegrate back into society. And that's really pretty much all I wanted to cover. I mean, this chapter is pretty straightforward. It goes into a lot of detail in regard to the juvenile justice system. I teach a whole class. I think I'm going to be offering that in the spring, called Juvenile Delinquency. So if you're interested in this whole concept of the juvenile justice system, or you want to work with juveniles, then make sure you take that class, because we'll go into a whole lot more detail. We'll get into the theories as to why kids commit crimes, and some of the things that have worked and some of the things that have not worked, and have a lot of good classroom discussions. So that's all for this week. Next week is going to be our last week of school, so there'll be one more integrity video, I think, for next week, and then we're done for the summer term. I've appreciated you guys being in class this term, and hope you learned something out of here. Have a good week. Bye-bye.